all of you. Let me start by thanking Dean Layton and Professor Kanupriya Dhingra and Professor Akshay Kale and everyone at the JSLL for inviting me to give this talk, which will soon also be published as an essay in a special issue. It's a privilege to share my work with all of you, and I welcome comments, questions, suggestions at the end of it. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So this essay reflects upon the lifetime's work in, for, and beyond poetry by the poet Adil Jussawalla. So let me just take a minute and share my slides here. Hopefully everything will be okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah, yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, let me go into the slide share mode. Okay. So think of a remarkable poet's apartment in Cuff Parade, South Bombay, where he has stored in one room the documents, materials he has collected over a lifetime of 80 plus years of the people, places, events, worlds, no piece of paper discarded. Think of these books, manuscripts, letters, diaries, news clippings, pictures, catalogs, tapes, scrapbooks, all sorted, put in boxes, folders, cupboards, and files. This is the Adil Jussawalla archive, a large part of which was donated by the poet to the Bombay Poets Archive in the Cornell University Library. The world of Bombay waxes and wanes through these differently scaled archival spaces guided by the poet's hand. The city, the country, and the world transform, mutate, and appear in different guises in each avatar of this larger archive. Within this larger collection is a planner or a notebook or a quote date book, as the Cornell Library's metadata calls it, which I propose to examine as an archive in itself, an observer of his world, and as a marker of Jussawalla's writing practice. This date book is a notebook that Adil Jussawalla kept in the 1970s as a data source for his then planned but eventually never finished novel titled Dolly Cabra. This planner or notebook creates a focused collection of time and space from an interregional and international set of disaggregated news headlines. And what is stored here are the day's events, abstracted and distilled from the news headlines the poet read. The process of its creation is fascinating on its own. Jussawalla kept track of potentially interesting news by cutting clippings and pasting them in large scrapbooks, out of which there are several in the Jussawalla collection in the Bombay Poets Archive. Then in the 70s, Jussawalla abstracted the news that seemed relevant for his novel from these scrapbooks and noted them down in his datebook. From the newspapers to the scrapbooks to the pages of the datebook, the material thus went through multiple levels of distillation and classification, as you can see. The datebook is a source book for the unwritten novel, but in the absence of the novel now, it is a medial space of the archive, not a source, not the beginning, as nothing ever is in the archive. There is always a previous trace, and the document in hand is always something that points to both the future and the past. There is also a circularity to the meanings moving through these traces and an environmental structure of information that explains the transplanting of the information in each individual document. For example, the news of the day lives in the scrapbook in one way, in the date book in another way, in the loose news clippings in a third way, and within a poem in the fourth. The date book then is one of the many ways in which Adil Jussawalla's archive is a witness to its time and place and a microcosm of his writerly practices over the years. The datebook is also part of the wider ecology of the Bombay Poets Archive, whose materials are interconnected across different scales of memories due to the divergent formats of archiving. Alexander B. Croft uses the term ecology in a more systematic fashion than I have room to do here, but nevertheless, it's useful to quote some of the ideas about ecology that undergird his book. Quote, "If we are dealing with a system in which the various inputs are not in fact equivalent to each other, or if we wish to keep the significance of those inputs distinct, ecology may provide an interesting and useful model. Ecologists examine the interactions between the different forms of life that exist in a particular region, as well as the interactions of those living things with their non-living environment. Ecology understands, accepts, and insists on the distinct and mutually interactive nature of these various inputs. These forms of archival genres then reside today in the Adil Jussawalla papers within the larger Bombay Poets Archive, within the even larger rare manuscripts collection at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, an Ivy League academic institution in the United States. The narrative of the unwritten novel by Jussawalla circulates in guises and forms through these very different archival genres of documents. A little bit about the Bombay Poets Archive. This was formally inaugurated in 2017, but the conversation about such an archive went on for years, maybe even a decade, ever since I approached Jussawalla for my first book on Bombay modernist print cultures. At a time when he found it difficult to locate a library or an archive that would accept all his materials and keep it secure and accessible, he chose to donate it to the Cornell Special Collections. And thanks to my wonderful co-conspirator, Dr. Bronwyn Bledsoe, that was possible at Cornell. This decision has been criticized by some since it takes the archive of an Indian poet outside the national bounds, but perhaps that complex inside-outside location of his work and his life is the story of his missing novel, as well as his own work. The complexity of the location of the datebook versus the locations presented within it indicate the journey of the poet across the decades, but also the changes in the times he lives in right now, as opposed to the time in the 1970s. The multiple locations of the story of the global/local and diegetic and extra-diegetic recreate a swirl of meanings, a storm of significations that transform a simple planner or a notebook of jottings into a literary event. First, the datebook itself. This is a planner that the poet used as a diary to jot down dates and news from the years 1972 and 73, and a little bit of 75 as well, for his novel Dolly Cabra. There's an interesting note about that English-sounding name, Dolly Cabra, which if we have time, we can talk about in the Q&A. To quote Jussawalla himself, Dolly Cabraji is the protagonist of the novel, Claire, his English wife, Ma, his mother. Dali has come from London to Bombay on an assignment to shoot a photo essay on the monsoon. Claire accompanies him. While in Bombay, they stay with Dali's parents at their flat in a Parsi colony. Dali's father is a Gandhian and supports the Congress party. Dali isn't committed to any ideology, but is leftish, liberal, like many of his generation at that time, the late 60s, early 70s. It's the failure of the monsoon and the subsequent drought and famine in Maharashtra in 72-73 that makes Dali rethink his position, draws him towards a more radical neo-Naxal ideology. This was the planned novel, but now that we only have the planning date book, we should read it for its form and for its fictional promise of giving us an entryway into the real world of the 70s and to the author's own life at the time, as part of an archival genre where it is located now. It bestows final intentions by establishing patterns and creating associations that move towards a narrative, even if not the narrative itself. More than 45 years later, at this point for us, it is much more than mere rough data for a future work. To quote George Topfer, archives are, quote, not just a burial ground of the past, but rather that which present the past as, quote, pure structures, relations, or concentrations that resulted from past events, end quote. The date book is a skeleton of that past of the 70s, if you will, the years that saw the big drought, which heralded the emergency in 75 and the build up to that enormous event in terms of street marches, violence, dissent, and rebellion. These notes for a novel are a record for a writer as he tried to frame the work of his protagonist, a journalist, and also mimic the very work of that journalist or protagonist of the proposed novel in Dolly Cabra. The presence of the datebook fragment in tandem with the absence of the corresponding novel. Jussawalla destroyed the 50 pages or so of the draft of the novel at that time. This forces us to consider this as a modernist fragment. The Sathottari spirit can be clearly seen in the Marathi and English little magazines around the country, and I have a little note up there, which I'm not reading on the screen. But this is part of that Sathotari spirit, which was there at that time in the print culture and writings in multiple languages in Bombay: Marathi, Hindi, Gujarati, and English, and several other languages. In English, there was Nissim Ezekiel's little magazine Poetry India, which you see on the screen on the right, which asserted the need to read writing in Indian English alongside that in other regional languages. In 1974, Penguin published the Anthology of Indian Writing, New Writing in India, edited by Adil Jussawalla. To this day, readers of the time remember the jolt of modernity they felt on seeing its table of contents and the kind of representation of modern Indian writing that the book presented. Rejecting the Orientalist imagination with regards to Indian writing in his introduction, Adil Jussawalla stated, quote, "In the best Indian writing, this is not the case. Not only is there an assured use of indigenous forms, but the content is so very much the product of local stresses and strains, the dialectics of a particular socio-economic situation, that the Western reader is more likely to be annoyed by a certain contrariness in the Indian's attitude to fundamental issues like war, sex, and poverty than be contemptuous of the similarities with his," end quote. In this introduction to the anthology published in 74, just when he was also collecting the news of the day in his date book, Jussawalla reiterates the desire to clear a space in literature for the modern post-colonial Indian voice, even as he also claims that this voice is dismembered. It is the witnessing done by Jussawalla in his poetry and much of the rest of his work. The sentiment expressed in the introduction is remarkably close to the proposed novel he was planning around the same time, in which the protagonist Dolly Cabra is also struggling with the effort to counter the mistaken notions of the Indian world by the foreign Time magazine. As Jussawalla explained to me in 2016, quote, "The novel was going to be in the form of a journal being kept by a professional photographer who was assigned to do a photo essay on the monsoons. To his dismay, as the days went on, he realized that the monsoon was going to fail. So it was a kind of political education for him to try and convince the foreign journal that had commissioned him to say that, look, I can't write this because it is too heart-wrenching because of the drought," end quote. In the proposed novel, the journalist Dolly Cabra refused the project from the foreign magazine because it was asking for something that was literally opposite of what he was seeing with his own eyes. In the real world, Adil Jussawalla ended up not writing this very novel about Dolly Cabra as well. His most famous book of poems, Missing Person, also talks about the breakdown of his language and the lack of a coherent place for a self, caught between the contradictory multiplicities of the position of the English writer in India. As he admitted in an interview to the Indian Literary Review in 1986, quote, "Perhaps this is a result of being a missing person. The cultural influences are not all integrated. There is an uneasy mixture. One cannot see the person. British readers have said about Indian English writing that it is often an uneasy mixture," end quote. In such maneuvering for a foothold, Jussawalla was part of a cohort of poets, particularly his close friends Arvind Krishna Mehrotra and Dilip Chitre, who tried each in their own way to establish a similar space for the Indian poet in English in Bombay. For example, there are two poems up there. I'll read just part of one. For example, in Van Gogh's Year, Dilip Chitre reiterates the refusal to be silenced in documenting the truth about his world in India. "No, Narcissus, I will not cut out my tongue and drop it in the nearest box, hoping it will reach its destination, an overseas silence." The Indian poet's anxiety is not unlike the concern of Jussawalla's protagonist, Dolly Cabra, who cannot fulfill his journalist's assignment. In the Sathotari period, each of these poets experimented with ways of rooting the Bombay modern with shoots that grew into both regional Indian cultural worlds as well as international modernism. How to align oneself with the global moment even as one separates one's voice that belongs to its rooted locale. Jussawalla reveals this concern in all his poems and in this date book as well. As Vivek Narayanan says of Jussawalla's writing, quote, "We should read Jussawalla's different genres, not separately, but as the work of a single hand," end quote. But let us forge ahead through the pages of the date book and its monthly displays on each page. The date book was originally printed for 1975, but Jussawalla retained the months and scratched out the year on each page so that it covered the months of 72, 73, and 75. Moreover, he struck out January, as you can see, and changed it to February on the first page. The days of the original planner do not match the poet's needs either, and Jussawalla struck out Wednesday on what was Wednesday, 1st January, though he does not replace it with anything else, as you can see on the left side of the screen. In each box for the days of the date book, the author meticulously wrote down snippets of news pertaining to that day and always color-coded them to match the categories of G or I or L. From the news tabulated in green, which is L, blue, which is G, and pink, which is I, it is clear that they refer to, L refers to local, I to Indian or national, and G to global. Besides the boxes for each day, at the bottom of the double page for each month, there is a section for notes in which Jussawalla wrote summaries for the plot line of the novel, and that one assumes would have matched these events in the boxes above. The diary is fascinating and elusive on so many levels. First, world events like the war in Cambodia and the death of Picasso make their presence felt in the story of Indian monsoons, as does the gradual takeover of Sikkim, seen here in the note, quote, India takes charge of law and order in Sikkim. Second, there is an entry listing, quote, first view of Mars on the right-hand side of the screen, together with, quote, new moon on the same day. But one is in blue and global, and the other is in green and local. The juxtaposition takes the news outside of the realm of pure worldly fact and the corresponding framing of the news and closer to the fictional form that peeks through from behind the date book format. Third, there are elisions. The diary changed days and years, as we saw earlier, but also shows some pieces of news initially written in, say, green and categorized as local, cancelled and written in blue, categorized as global. See at the bottom left of the screen here. Through these snippets, color coding and juxtapositions, Jussawalla consciously attempted to establish these linkages between the Indian urban condition and that of the rest of the global South, as well as the North. For instance, in his interview with the Indian Literary Review, he talks about his writing in Missing Person. Quote, missing person presents a problem, the guilt of the bourgeois intellectual. It does not get out of the problem. The uniqueness of the poem is in presenting the Indian bourgeois intellectual with links to other third world bourgeois intellectuals. I was trying to map the area. The poem doesn't offer any solutions, end quote. In the date book as well, the slippage between the global and the local is striking. But here it indicates a sense of dizzy interconnectedness and also the inability to draw lines across these ideological spaces, even as the poet makes such an attempt. As Jussawalla says in one of his essays, Out of Place, quote, I've been back 10 days after a 7-week trip abroad, and my eye finds nothing to anchor itself to. All's in flux. Parallel spools of film unspool in my head, get entangled with one another, at times jam, end quote. Much before the idea of the interlocal became rooted in our critical vocabulary, Jussawalla was here trying to negotiate the interlayering of multiple spatialities and temporalities. This is what Jahan Ramazani, for example, describes as translocal poetics, quote, neither localist nor universalist, neither nationalist nor vacantly globalist. A translocal poetics highlights the dialogic intersections, sometimes tense and resistance, sometimes openly assimilative, of specific discourses, genres, techniques, and forms of diverse origins, end quote. The diary points to the vanishing sense of the local that it tries to pin down, the elusive sense of being Indian in the multitudinous global world of the Sathotari period. Even as he tries to chart a distinct modern Indian experience, we also see here in this planner, as in all his work, the honest refusal to cut the world off from an insular Indian experience. The green, blue, and pink easily slide one into the other. The years documented in the diary when the Penguin Modern Indian Writing Anthology was also being published and Missing Person was in preparation at this time, were the years that split into the emergency period, a time when Adil Jussawalla also witnessed a lot of political activity and protest in the college where he taught and around him in the city. He notes for August 11, 1975, a month and a half after the emergency was declared in this date book, he notes this, quote, civic services crippled for strike, medical aid, people turned away, Fort University paralyzed, end quote. That too is an important background for reading this state book and its contents. The political stance matters here. The dilemma and the fragmented selves of the protagonist of Dolly Cabra continue to stay at the center of Jussawalla's consciousness, as we see in his well-known presentation later at the Singapore ACLAS conference in 1986, titled Being There, Aspects of an Indian Crisis. In this talk, Jussawalla gestures to a continuing re-evaluation when he says, quote, I believe that no Indian writer can avoid taking a moral stand on the many social evils in his country, especially when, in view of the obvious poverty and distress there, it's a social privilege to be able to write or travel abroad and pontificate as I am doing, end quote. So what is the role of the writer? And what are the various silences he battles with when, as an Indian writer in English, he attempts to make room for the voice of someone who has affiliations in multiple spaces and a myriad of cultural and linguistic histories? Of the many boundary lines that are drawn and crossed in figuring out the poet's role, we as readers can also ask, what are the connection lines with Indian writing here? The unfulfilled promise of the date book shows us the, quote, moral stand that the young Jussawalla was trying to take. Already in the 60s, the young poet railed against the failed English poetry of the past, as in the essay titled The New Poetry by Jussawalla, quote, and I'm quoting from the essay. Firstly, if the writing of poetry implies a particular kind of sensitivity to language and a willingness to tax and stretch the language, the best poetry in English has been written by Indian novelists. No Indian poet writing in English has equaled the kind of verbal dexterity we find in Raja Rao's Kantapura or G.V. Desani's All About Mr. Hatter. Secondly, where one expects to find political commitment in the poetry of a country as sorely in need of it as India, one finds none, end quote. Like this essay, the date book shows the attempt to be true to the world around him, both in the novel's protagonist, but also by Jussawalla himself. Studiously collected, excerpted, and now in the planner arranged date-wise, the news items of the day become primed and ready to be used in a novel to be written. The novel was supposed to be a witness to the reality, however unromantic and disaster-ridden, and to instantiate a fidelity to the empirical life of this world. As he says in one of his newer poems in the book Shorelines, book of poems Shorelines, this is at the bottom of the screen on the right. Here he's kicking sand, hoping to find a lost aircraft's wheel on the beach, the one that came down, a fact, in the Thar. The exclamation, a fact, is doubly meant here. It emphasizes that the lost aircraft is quote unquote real news and not something imaginary, but it also demonstrates the heightened emotion about the factual, the desire to note, to document, and to witness the post-colonial Indian world of the writer. Thomas Osborne states that, quote, the archive is a means of generating ethical and epistemological credibility, end quote. This notion of factual singularity that the poem hopes to generate functions in a manner similar to the obsessive listing of the news in the date book as an archive of sorts. Quote, whether as notion, impression, concept, or anti-concept, the image of the archive is a useful focal point for bringing together issues of representation, interpretation, and reason with questions of identity, evidence, and authenticity, end quote. Even if the archive is never neutrally factual, it does raise the question of facticity and authenticity through its very existence and makes witnessing the subject of scrutiny in the date book. With the presence of the actual dates, but the absence of the intended writing, which it heralds, The datebook represents the alternating strands of memory and forgetting, a persistent theme in Jussawalla's writings, noted by several scholars, including Letitia Zecchini and Vivek Narayanan. However, besides the material presences and absences in the datebook and in the proposed structure of the Dolly Cabra novel, I want to explore the processes of memory and forgetting in the contents of the personal archive of the poet and the Cornell Bombay Poets Archive, because they are connected with this datebook. The dual desire to remember and forget, with the anguished need to witness, reoccurs in Jussawalla's work and in his archival collections. Shut Up Memory, a piece that Jussawalla, himself both a journalist and poet at that time, wrote in the popular magazine Gentleman in May 1997, ends with a line that says, "Speak, memory, speak." In the Bombay Poets Archive at Cornell, there is a 1979 copy of the Elphinstone College Quarterly, the college where Adil Jussawalla used to teach, with an interview with the poet, which goes thus, quote, the interviewer, "Why did you become a writer?" Adil Jussawalla: "I wrote in order to remember better. Since I now want to forget most of the things I wanted to remember, I can't think why I wanted to remember them in the first place." Another piece of Jussawalla and Gentleman in 2001, titled Out of Place, carries the insistent beat, forget it, as he tries to make sense of the overlays of times and spaces in his life. I quote, "I go to the gallery and see what's supposed to be contemporary German art on display. If this is what contemporary art is, forget it. If I mention this gallery to my friend, forget it. If this is what I've come to, forget it, please forget it. I can't connect. A glass of tea may help," end quote. In the talk at the ACLAS conference in Singapore in 1989, Jussawalla insisted on the need to be witness to history, along with the admission that the modern Indian writer are not such good witnesses after all. The desire to memorialize, along with the reality of the lack of witnessing, makes the poet akin to the quote, "the revolving man," as he says, dizzy with contradictions, trying to forget what he wrote down to remember. Quote, this is at the bottom of the screen, "Some of us certainly are going through a crisis which is making us question the validity of our work and our usefulness as agents of social change. Now more than ever before, we are unsure of ourselves as witnesses. Far from helping to change the course of history, we are finding ourselves its bullied victims. It's as though history had become the Englishman in Victor Anand's novel, The Revolving Man, telling the writer, as the Englishman tells the novel's protagonist, 'Spin, you Hindu bastard, spin.' And the bastard goes on spinning," end quote. The entanglement of forgetting in the remembering, the stratifying of past and presents, and the uncertainty of the way to record the act of witnessing are the theme of the unfinished novel Dolly Cabra, as well as the material context of the fragmentary datebook. The complicated relationship of the poetry to the act of witnessing reveals the long experienced conflictual relationship between social reality and literary writing, mulled over by writers over time, over long periods of time, right? But in a recent study of this connection between the catastrophic material world and the writing of poets in a book titled Calamity Form, Anahid Nersessian notes that the quote, "poetics of calamity," end quote, is writing that has an uneasy relation to the real, not indexical, but transversal, where, quote, "the disaffirmations of poetry are ways of turning absence into a curious kind of presence." Through this archival process in the datebook, but also in the larger Jussawalla archive, one can see Jussawalla asserting his membership in the Society of Multilingual Artists and Writers, whose news pieces he curated in his collection. He's also claiming a space in that world of so-called vernacular life of farmers, players, sportspeople, politicians, famine and surplus, wars and incursions, global politics, and regional upheavals. In short, he's clearing a space for himself in the India that he's demarcating, firmly in its own place and yet part of the network of international exchanges. The datebook holds a peculiar promise of providing unmediated access to the inner workings of the writer, the unfiltered true self that gets masked in creative writing, or so is the assumption of that genre, the promise to deliver the world to the reader. The very form of a confessional mode that is evoked here casts a shade, actually, on what is the real of everything within it. And yet, as we saw earlier, the author's mind is at work, patterning, arranging, manipulating the news in his own idiosyncratic way. So there is no unfettered access to any pristine real world here. There cannot be. Nor can we get a similar privileged access to the author's own interiority through this planner any more or any less than we can through his poems or essays. Instead, there is a continuum in terms of themes, worldviews, and forms between this planner and the essays of nonfiction, as well as the poems of a lifetime. Thomas Osborne lists publicity, singularity, and mundanity as the spirits of the archive. All three are evident in the date book and its processes of documentation. We saw how the move across the borders of private to public, relatively speaking, create a futurity for the text that it did not possess in its original location and intent. The emphasis on quote unquote facts in the date book enables the effect of particularity or singularity of the micro events, but also of the world and the time that it's being documented. And the exercise of creating such a date book produces an everyday effect of mundanity. In his essay, A Balancing Act, Jussawalla writes, quote, "So while all you lovely tightrope artists inch your ways forward above me, I'll stick to the ground if you don't mind. Defying gravity and pondering weighty matters aren't for me unless the weight is of the sort that concerned Sisyphus. Rolling a stone up a hill when it always rolls down once it gets to the top is a clownish act. Sisyphus is one of an ancient civilization's great clowns," end quote. Like the archive that collects seemingly meaningless bits of papers and documents that together signifying something, the datebook also collects seemingly unrelated pieces of daily news, which together were supposed to indicate a creative project and a meaningful goal. To quote Thomas Osborne again, quote, "It is not just that archives happen to be rather ordinary spaces or that they give access to the everyday and the mundane. Rather, the everyday, or if one prefers that we can see the import of the everyday, is itself an effect of archivality," end quote. This is, of course, an unending and unachievable task. The novel never got written, and also in the very nature of all such archives. While the singular and the everyday are the necessary effect of the archive, they are an ever receding goal. Instead, the datebook reveals a mind at work and a world being structures, but with no finite end. And the ecological connections across the datebook, the nonfiction, the scrapbooks, the poetry, all together show the poet's mind working at different scales and in different formats towards a complex and broad vision of the poetic world. The seemingly mundane details or facts of the everyday achieve a luminous uniqueness, a heightened sense of the ordinary because of the selection in the datebook. We bestow on them a value of futurity, a meaning that we expect them to bear, but which in the absence of the novel resides only in the green, blue, and pink colors of the poet's pen and the framing they perform. In his book of poems, I Dreamt a Horse Fell from the Sky, Adil Jussawalla has a poem titled Turning 70. "My body is a pile of papers left behind on a bench. Ordered to be burnt, it sits unruffled. My body is a plant that came with the tag, for show. I stand in the garden, puzzled. All day I stand, splodged with blossoms like Pierrot. The body is compared to a plant in full bloom. The colors of the blossoms are associated with the multicolored costume of a clown or a Pierrot, usually the sad clown. Can one place the many-hued diary of data for the novel alongside this Pierrot? Can one mark the culture of documentation in this diary, this attempt to document the drought in the early 70s as the poet's mind, quote, splodged with blossoms of many colors? There is yet another poem by Jussawalla that shows the body on show, but this time it is flayed by its task of being truthful to the world. This is a short poem first published on Facebook online in 2018. It's titled Merceus Continues. The painkillers work, my heart's still in it, none of its layers bleeds. Thank you for waiting. These are some of the beats it skipped when the concert ended in a riptide of blades. Marsyas was skinned alive by Apollo for his hubris in challenging Apollo to a musical duel between Marsyas' skill with the flute and Apollo's expertise with the lyre. Here, the modern Bombay poet is still going strong, older and now on medications, literally, but still writing, injured, but still vibrant. His heart is still in it, in both the idiomatic sense, but also in the striking visual of the heart or the blood, the flaying of the flesh. And combining the brutal disposition of the world with the music of his work in the, quote, beats of his poetry. Note the wonderful pun on beats. The beats connect to the violence of the world that has skinned the poet's mind raw. And then there is the human heartbeat, which is at the center of all art. And finally, the musical rhythmic beat of the poet's writing, regardless of all the violence, frustration, and the spiritual, political, aesthetic disappointment of the times. The poet reminds us of these missing beats from current poetry, maybe even from his own earlier poetry, who knows? As he lays open his perennially flayed insides for the reader's view and as material for music. The innards are the strings for this life-taking, but also life-giving music, even though they are also curiously look like, quote, the splodged blossoms of the previous poem and of the date book. Both poems, in their stance of standing with their flayed or bright-colored insides open to view, depending on how one looks at it, recreate the compulsive, colorful framings of the date book, which also stands open, arms and pages spread out, displaying its vibrant insides, waiting, puzzled, for a reader to decipher its tantalizing secrets. Thank you.